Welcome to More Than Words, a podcast about treating the whole child, brought to you by the Reading and Language Learning Center. I'm your host, Tristan, and today I'm joined by licensed school psychologist, Dr. James Siddall, to discuss how schools identify and support students with dyslexia and other learning differences. So, hi, Dr. Siddall, how are you?
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. We're excited for you to be here. This is such a good topic to discuss, something that I think everyone wants to know more and more about all the time. So let's get started with a little introduction about you. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Thank you so much. I'm Dr. James Siddall. I'm a licensed school psychologist. I currently work in private practice in Arlington, Virginia. I have my own boutique psychological practice called JDS Psychoeducational Services, where I do psychoeducational evaluations. I do some executive functioning coaching. And one of the things I really love to do is to work with families as a kind of consultant and slash advocate for students with disabilities in order to help families navigate the special education process, or really even in a more broad sense, how to gain access to services that they may need for their child, especially if they've just gotten a diagnosis, they're trying to figure out what to do next. I love working with those families in order to help them craft and create a comprehensive plan.
Yeah, that's awesome. Such important work. So thanks for doing it. And so you said you're in the Virginia area. So if people were to look for your services, where would they find you?
Correct. So I work out of Arlington, Virginia. You can find me online at jdspsychoed.com, as well as sending an email is the easiest way to get in touch with me at jsiddell@jdspsychoed.com.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll put your website and email in the show notes and people can reach out to you however they please.
Awesome. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. All right. So let's hop into the meat of the meat and potatoes of today.
Sounds great.
Yeah, let's start off with just a really good basis. So can you tell us a little bit about what happens before a student actually begins the identification process? There are these acronyms that are always thrown around like RTI and MTSS, and let's get into what those mean.
Of course, yeah. I think it's really important to understand that even before a student reaches the point of going through the identification process, there's often a lot happening behind the scenes where teachers and schools are working with students in order to identify where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, and then help provide them supports before we even get to that identification process where we suspect a student may have a disability. So, that's a great question in terms of RTI and MTSS, because those, we throw around a lot of acronyms
Yes.
in education. And so it can be kind of difficult to understand, like, how do these fit together? So first, RTI, it stands for response to intervention. And it was
Okay.
really a framework developed to identify and provide more intensive services for students, specifically with reading and math concerns, is
Mm,
typically where it's used most often. So
okay.
if you think about we love our pyramids in education with this stuff. So if you think about a pyramid and all of the students kind of at the base receive what we refer to as tier one services. So that includes things like the general curriculum, general behavioral practices, or just things that teachers are doing with every single student,
Okay.
regardless of their strengths and weaknesses. And then all students are often screened then for reading difficulties, math difficulties, things like that. And if a student is identified as needing more intensive services, then they often receive what we would call tier two services. So we go up a little bit in the pyramid, it gets a little bit smaller number of students. And that may look like extra time with the teacher reinforcing some of those reading skills. It could include sometimes small groups with a reading specialist, for instance. And then those students who still continue to have difficulties and are not making grade level progress, they are often identified for either tier three services. So some schools will utilize a tier three model where they'll provide even more intensive interventions,
Okay.
or in some schools, they will utilize special education as that tier three. So once a student does not respond in tier two, then they actually begin the process of being identified for a potential disability.
Okay.
And qualified, then they receive the higher kind of tier three services. And so that's kind of RTI in a nutshell.
Gotcha.
MTSS is actually more of an umbrella term that encompasses RTI. RTI tends to be one half of that pyramid. And then on the other side will be behavioral supports. So often
Oh,
talking about multi-tiered systems of support or MTSS, we're talking about a more comprehensive system where we are looking at both the academic side as well as the social, emotional, and behavioral side of things
mm,
as well. And so in that sense, MTSS tends to be that umbrella term that RTI kind of fits under
gotcha.
uh, in a lot of ways. So before students even identified, as I said, they often are being screened. And in fact, in Virginia, this is now a legal requirement.
Wow.
So back in 2020, the Virginia legislature and governor signed what's called HB 410, which actually requires that every single school in Virginia has to provide reading screening, so a dyslexia screening. And then if a student fails that screening, then it's required that they be provided with some sort of additional support. And parents have to be notified that their child did not pass that
Wow.
particular screening.
Wow.
And so once students get into that process, then they're often provided with intensive reading intervention for, let's say, a set number of weeks. So it can be 8 weeks, 12 weeks. And if a student is still not making progress, then parents are again required to be notified.
Right.
Those interventions may continue. And so all of that is happening even before a student is brought to the table at a
Right.
school for being considered for having any kind of reading disability or anything like that. They often are going through that process. And so that's one of those things that can be, it is both a good and a bad thing
Yeah.
in a sense.
Right.
As a parent, it's a good thing because it means that the school is not necessarily waiting for kids to fail, which has been a
Right.
common critique with the special education process.
Mm,
It's kind of this, well, we have to wait until they're significantly far behind before we provide any interventions. And RTI was really meant to get in there and provide supports before a student reaches that point.
right.
So it's very positive from that standpoint.
Right.
It can also be frustrating for some families
Yeah.
because a lot of times schools may be reluctant to move forward with the identification process for special
Mm,
education until a significant amount of RTI has occurred. So until a student has received some type of tier two interventions or supports, they may be hesitant to go through the special education identification process because they want to see how that student is responding to the intervention first before they
right.
move in that process.
That is so interesting. Thanks for like laying it all out. Because like you said, I don't know if parents know that all of this is kind of like going on in the background before you even get to even discussing the idea of an IEP or a 504 plan or any of those kinds of things. So that is really helpful to know. And like you said, kind of a good and a bad, right? With the frustrating, like you can't really move forward because they're doing other things. They want to see how the first thing goes. But yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Mhm.
So let's say they've done some RTI or MTSS or anything like that, and we've got a kiddo that needs to start the identification process. How does that work? And like, who's the catalyst for it? Is it the parent? Like, can the parent start it, or is it the school that has to start the identification process?
That's a great question. So the identification process can actually be started by anyone who works with that child or is involved in that child's life. In terms of that, they could be a parent, it could be a guardian, it could be their teacher, it could be a specialist they work with. Technically, anyone can submit a request to the school in order to begin the identification process.
Okay.
And so if sometimes, again, when we're talking about reading interventions, sometimes a student will be in those tier two interventions first,
Right.
and or a school will move forward. There may also be situations where a different disability, something other than a reading disability, so this could be a suspected autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, something like that could be suspected. And if that's the case, sometimes that identification process can start very quickly. So I've
Okay.
Had students, for instance, when I used to work in schools, who came in and sometimes they transferred into the school, and it was, very noticeable to school staff that there may be some significant needs going on. And so
Right.
we start that process right away.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, I've also had parents reach out to the school before their student even attends. So if they're
Oh,
thinking of transferring, for instance. So
yeah.
I worked with families who may have been in a private school, for instance, before, where they didn't have these support services, and they're considering moving into the public school system. They know
Mm.
their child may have some needs. And so they are actually able to reach out to the school before the child even attends
Wow.
and get a request, and then a meeting has to occur in that case as well. And so school districts, one thing that's I think important to note is that schools and school districts in the public school system are actually required to go through this process for any student that resides within their boundaries.
Wow.
So students who are in private schools, I've done evaluations for students who, are currently in private school, may not be receiving any special education services through the county itself.
Hmm.
But parents, may want that identification for any number of reasons, or they may want the testing that
Right.
goes along with it, as well. So that process can be started by parents, by family members, or it can be initiated by the school. It's really anyone who has an interest that that child
Yeah.
can submit paperwork. It doesn't even have to be that formal. If a parent can
Wow.
send an email the school administrators and say, "Hey, I'm concerned. I think my child may have a disability," and I do recommend using that term in particular,
Okay.
uh, because a lot in terms of legal protections and processes. And I think it's, again, important to note that when we begin this identification process, this is a legal process. So
Right.
the entire process is defined within federal law, state law, and there are a number of rules and regulations and things that go on with that. And so if a family uses the word, as they say, I suspect my student may have a disability, that's pretty much an automatic trigger to say, okay,
Okay.
we need to begin this process in some way, shape, or form. It's not just, oh, we're going to have like a meeting with the counselors or a meeting with their teacher. This is going to be a bigger meeting
Right.
that has a lot of different people in it. That being said, you're also welcome to, some families don't necessarily want that big meeting. They just
Hmm.
want to talk to the teacher. They just want to talk to a counselor or an admin. And so they're also welcome to kind of state, what type of meeting they would like to have. And as long as it's in writing, even if they say, I may suspect a disability, but first I'd really like to have a different meeting that's kind of
Mm.
smaller, they're welcome to request that as well. And as long as that's in writing, most administrators will be just fine with that and are welcome to have that smaller meeting before kind of bringing the whole team
Right.
in. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, anyone can start that process.
Wow, that's good to know. I didn't realize like if you had like an outside, someone who provided support to the child, they could also kind of request that the identification process starts. So that's interesting to know. And I really appreciate that you noted that anyone within the bounds like of a specific county, like the school has to work with them, right?
Mhm. Yes.
Yeah, that's I think important because I've had people who they talked about getting services for someone who was younger, which I don't know if that's a different process altogether, but someone who wasn't ready to start school but was like right on the cusp, and since they were in the county, like their child was able to kind of get services through the school system. So I think that's an important thing to note.
That's a great question, actually,
Yeah.
because school districts are actually required starting at age 2.5.
Oh, okay.
Starting at age 2.5, that is when the public school system actually takes over for disability services.
Gotcha.
Oftentimes, counties will have what they call early intervention
Hmm.
services. Families are often served through something called an IFS, referred to as an IFSP, or an individual family service plan.
Oh, okay.
And so that often happens actually with students. I've seen it happen a lot with students who are identified with things like genetic conditions.
Mm.
They come home from the hospital and the families know, okay, this child's going to need support for whatever condition they may have. and they may often be identified even earlier than 2.5. And then, but once a student turns 2.5, between 2.5 and 3, then the public school system actually takes over those support services. So they often have to
Wow.
go through that identification process through a specific office. There tends to be a specific office within each school division that operates in that like 2.5 to 5 range. So like two and
Okay.
a half until they start kindergarten. And so families can go to the school district if they have speech concerns, developmental concerns, whatever it may be. They're welcome to go through that process, through the school system as young as 2.5 years old.
Wow. That is great. That is awesome to know. I don't know if many parents know that. So thank you for mentioning that. And you mentioned testing. So does the school have to do testing? If that is true, what does it look like? Do they provide diagnoses, like all of those kinds of things?
That's a great question. So the school system has what is legally referred to as a child find obligation.
Okay.
So what that means is that it is on the school district they have to proactively be able to identify students who may have a disability.
Okay.
And that's where a lot of this process is born out of. And that's why if you go to the school as a parent, for instance, and say, hey, I'm concerned my child may have a disability, that's when all of these legal processes start to kick in.
Right.
And where all this kind of starts is that the school is required to identify any students with potential disabilities. So the first step that's going to happen in that process is if once a parent makes a request or once a school employee makes a request, they have to hold a meeting within 10 business days
Oh, okay.
that request being made. So that is a firm legal obligation.
Right.
In about 2 weeks, there has to be a meeting scheduled. And the name of this meeting will vary depending on the school district, but it's sometimes referred to as a student study meeting or a child study meeting, or sometimes it's even referred to as an IEP identification meeting
Oh,
or
okay.
something like that. But there is a meeting that has to occur.
Okay.
And at that meeting, there will be a bunch of personnel.
Mhm.
So there has to be an administrator.
Okay.
There has to be the child's regular education teacher.
Okay.
There has to be a teacher who is certified in special education.
All right.
There has to be a school psychologist,
Mm,
actually, at all of these meetings.
yeah.
And then there are other personnel who may be invited depending on what the referral concerns are. So this could include, for instance, a speech language pathologist. It could
Right.
include an occupational therapist, a physical therapist. Any of those types of specialties may be at that meeting if it's within the bounds of what the areas of concern that are noted are.
Okay.
And so that meeting is kind of the first step.
Gotcha.
And the goal of that meeting is really to decide, does the school system need to go forward with an evaluation in order to determine whether or not this child has a disability that requires special education services?
Okay.
And I word that very particularly,
Yeah.
as you noticed, because school systems and schools sometimes will get to that meeting and then there's a lot of data shared at that meeting. So that's
Okay.
where they look at behavioral data, reports from the teacher, any kind of screenings that may have occurred. Schools actually have a lot of data on all of their students,
Yeah.
especially at the elementary level. And so all of that data will come to play in that meeting. All the concerns will be discussed. And then as a team, the team has to decide kind of what the next steps are.
Okay.
And just because a meeting is called does not mean that the school system will go forward with an evaluation.
Oh, okay.
However, if a parent is very concerned and they want to go forward with that evaluation, most districts will go forward with at least the evaluation part of it
Okay.
because they would rather have the data and the information
Right.
there. They definitively, yes, the student has a disability, or no, the data does not support a disability in this case. They'd rather have all that data than to not have it in most
Right.
cases. And so during that meeting, there may also be discussions of whether or not the child may require special education services, whether they require maybe Section 504 accommodations, which is a whole separate kind of
Right.
support system. And so if let's say a student, we come to this meeting, the team agrees, yes, the student, we have concerns.
Right.
So we suspect that the student may have a disability. Then the school is required to conduct an evaluation.
Okay.
They typically, legally, they have about 65 days in which they have to conduct this evaluation. Most school districts will try to do it a little bit shorter than that, maybe 55 days, due to not wanting to kind of run over the timelines, and then the state gets annoyed with school districts when they're not following the timeline. So, 55, 65 days within that kind of time frame. And that evaluation will really depend on what the concerns are in terms of what it looks like. So all evaluations will essentially contain three major components. One is a social or developmental history.
Okay.
Another is a psychological evaluation that looks at a student's cognitive abilities, cognitive processing, as well as looking at their social, emotional, and behavioral concerns as well, if there are any of those concerns, or if not, sometimes it's just a screening to say, hey, there are no social emotional concerns here, but maybe academic in nature. There will also be an educational evaluation conducted as well, which looks at a student's reading, writing, and math skills as compared to other students their age. That's within its own kind of formalized testing. And depending on the school district, these are sometimes split into several different reports by several different people. But that, again, depends on the district and the state. So in Virginia, typically, the social histories, developmental history, that may be done by a social worker, a school social worker. Whereas the psychological evaluation will be done by the school psychologist. And then the educational evaluation will often be done by a special education teacher. Who will conduct that part of testing. Now, I say that depends on the state. I actually previously, I did my training actually at the University of South Carolina, and worked in some South Carolina schools during my training. And there, the school psychologist was in charge of all of that. So it was one comprehensive report. The school psychologist did all of it. And so that may look a little bit different depending on the state that the student is in. And then again, depending on, so those are the three kind of core components. That will be pretty much every evaluation. There will sometimes be additional evaluations, again, depending on the referral concerns. So if there are occupational therapy concerns, there may be an occupational therapy evaluation. If there are speech concerns, there may be a speech language evaluation. If there's physical therapy, I've had students with vision issues, so we had to do a functional vision assessment to determine whether or not they presented with a visual impairment. And so, what that evaluation may look like and all the components will really depend on what the concerns that the student is presenting with. And so all of those evaluations are then completed. They have to be completed prior to the date. Eventually there will be a date set for the ability meeting. And at that meeting, the goal is to determine whether or not a student qualifies for services. And so a lot of times practitioners will have those reports completed a couple days in advance. Again, depending on the practitioner, some practitioners will be willing to talk to the parents before the meeting and go over the evaluation, kind of what they found, what it may mean, and kind of help prepare in that situation. So I do recommend for parents to reach out to their school psychologist or, prior to that meeting date, especially a couple days before, a week beforehand, to set up a meeting. So once they conduct those evaluations, then they come to the eligibility meeting. It is important to know. So that's a great question about, can schools provide a diagnosis? The answer here is qualified no. And the reason I say that is because a school psychologist or any professional working within a school setting is not allowed to provide a medical diagnosis as the medical system is concerned. So the medical system is separate from the educational and school system. And they have some interaction and overlap, but in a formal sense, schools cannot provide medical diagnoses. And medical diagnoses are not in and of themselves sufficient to provide school identifications.
Oh, okay.
They are separate entities.
Gotcha.
And so, but the reason I put the qualifier on there is because skilled school personnel will often still follow the DSM, in which is our, kind of large book of all mental health disorders that defines
Right.
even private practice, kind of defines, what diagnoses can be given and what those criteria are. And so what you'll often hear is the term kind of educational diagnosis,
Okay.
where, school psychologists may identify, for instance, yes, the student meets the criteria for, let's say, an autism spectrum disorder or ADHD.
Right.
And depending on the practitioner and kind of how the school system policies work, some will be more readily willing to use those medical terms. So this is often where there's been a debate, for instance, around the use of the term dyslexia
Okay.
within schools, that, and this is one of the more schools are now willing to use the term dyslexia because it has been more clarified by the powers that be. That term is not, you can use that term within school settings. For a long time, a lot of practitioners did not use the term simply because they were under the impression that they were not allowed to provide medical diagnoses, and dyslexia is
Oh,
considered a medical diagnosis.
right.
So you would often see reports where the language, and you'll still see this in a lot of reports as well, where they'll kind of hedge their language a little bit,
Okay.
and they'll say presents with symptoms or characteristics of X. And
Gotcha.
so they'll use that language because they can't provide a medical diagnosis, but they've oftentimes a good school-based evaluation will cover all of the areas that, for instance, a private, psychoeducational evaluation would cover.
Right.
So they're utilizing the same scales, the same data, and if they're doing that well, they may have all the evidence required for a medical diagnosis,
Okay.
but they can't provide it because they don't work within a medical setting.
Gotcha.
And so a lot of times what I've actually encouraged parents to do when I was working in school settings was to actually take my report
Hmm.
and go to a medical provider, go to the pediatrician, for instance, who could provide a medical diagnosis based on the data collected in school.
Okay.
So yeah, it gets
Yeah.
very complicated. It gets a little confusing,
Right.
and it can be very tough because, you know, I've had parents where we've gone through the evaluation process and we've identified, look, your child has all these characteristics of, let's say, ADHD,
Hmm.
and they will then go around and say, well, but my child doesn't have a diagnosis
Right.
of ADHD, which is technically correct, unless they go to their pediatrician and get that diagnosis. But all of the data has been collected there, and
Right.
that's then used in the eligibility process. So
Right.
in the state of Virginia, for instance, if I'm working in a school and I conduct psychological evaluation, I utilize, gather sufficient data to determine, yes, this child has ADHD, for instance, then we can say in the eligibility paperwork that, yes, they have ADHD,
Okay.
right, as far as the educational eligibility is concerned.
Right.
So yeah, so that gets very weird territory
Yeah.
about can they provide a diagnosis.
Yeah. I was curious about that. And I'm glad you mentioned the kind of like taking your report and going to your psychologist, because I know for some parents, like the diagnosis is important simply for like insurance purposes if they're going to like do anything, if they're going to get any outside services. And I didn't realize, you could kind of like take that report and go somewhere. Cause I was going to ask you about outside testing. Do you ever recommend that parents get like private, like testing from a private psych or any kind of testing in that realm?
Yes. And obviously that's part of my job.
Right.
That's what I do as well. I do think that it can be very helpful in certain circumstances and certain
Right.
instances. So, for instance, if a family goes through that evaluation process and for whatever reason they feel like they are not, that the quality of the school testing, they weren't feeling like they really uh, were getting the answers that they were seeking, or
Hmm.
they think that there's other things that may be going on that weren't really evaluated for. I think that's a great reason to look at private testing.
Right.
There are also times where, a lot of the schools that I've worked in have been pretty good about doing the evaluations. Some schools push back more and
Mm,
may not do the evaluations like they should. And so in those cases, I think families, if they go and get outside testing, then they have that data to bring to the school and
right.
any potential diagnoses to the school as well. So that can be, a great aspect there. There are also times where, school-based testing, and this is a big difference that I do want to get into a little bit
Yeah.
more later. Well, when we talk about support, but school-based evaluations and school-based services are very much targeted at school access.
Okay.
And that is a big difference between private and public services.
Right.
And so sometimes families are looking for more
Hmm.
in terms of outside services, outside supports. And that's where outside evaluations can be very helpful, and private evaluations can be helpful in taking a broader perspective on the
Right.
child. Sometimes they'll go more in depth as well and look at, various aspects or processes that may be impacting that child at home,
Right.
but may not have as large of a school-based impact as
Okay.
well. And so in those instances, I think, it can be very important to get outside testing.
Right.
Well, and I've had a lot of parents who maybe they don't agree with the conclusions that the school comes to. And so they want to get, their own data. They want someone outside that system. And so that's, again, a great reason to go and look for outside testing and services.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for hitting on that. And you had mentioned in once you get you've got the identification process started and you've maybe done some testing and all that kind of stuff, then you have the eligibility meeting for the support services, right? So is that where a student would then qualify for services going forward?
Yes. So that's a great question looking at how does that eligibility process work? And this is
Right.
often kind of the crux of it, right?
Yeah.
So the eligibility meeting is actually very similar to the first meeting in the sense of there's a lot of different people around the table.
Hmm.
And so this is where it's important to note, for families that you are a prime participant in this meeting.
Right.
I think a lot of times families can be intimidated because they come in, there's a lot of personnel around the table.
Right.
I've had meetings where there's, 10 people
Oh my
around the
gosh.
table,
Yeah.
based on the child's profile and concerns. And that can be very intimidating, but it's important to note that, parents, you are a prime advocate for your child and you are a key component to this meeting.
Right.
Uh, and so when looking at eligibility, and I'm going to split a little bit here and say very specifically for special education.
Okay.
So when looking at special education eligibility, there are actually three core requirements that are required for a student to qualify for special education services.
Okay.
Part one is, do they present with some type of disability or condition?
Okay.
And so, that's where the testing really informs that first question, right?
Right.
Do they have ADHD? Do they not have ADHD? Do they have autism? Do they not have autism?
Right.
Do they have a learning disability? Do they not have a learning disability?
Yeah.
And so there are actually 13 different eligibility categories under which students can be found eligible for special education services.
Oh, wow.
And so they're very distinct categories and entities. So for instance, if a student has a reading concern, that would be under the specific learning disability
Okay.
category. If the one that gets really weird and kind of throws families off is that if a student has ADHD, that's actually considered under a category called other health impairment,
Oh,
which is a very broad category that
yeah.
encompasses a lot of different conditions. But ADHD does not actually have its own eligibility category within the
Hmm.
federal regulations. So it's often considered under that other health impairment
Gotcha.
criteria. And so the testing is brought to bear to really understand, okay, do they present with a condition?
Hmm.
And that is as defined in those regulations as
Okay.
well. So depending on the district, for instance, different districts may have different definitions of what constitutes a learning disability, for
Right.
instance. That's not consistent across districts. It's not
Yeah.
consistent. states. And so it really is, are they meeting the requirements based on whatever criteria are laid out within that district's policies? And those criteria are set by a combination of federal, state, and then local regulations kind of all go
Okay.
into what these definitions are. And so that tends to be the first kind of main question. Do they present with this condition as it is stated in these regulations?
Right. Right.
And it's important to note that that is different than do they simply have a diagnosis.
Oh,
So this can be, especially for learning disabilities, is where I've seen a lot of points of contention, right? So depending on so sometimes I've seen students, for instance, who come in with a diagnosis of a learning disability,
hmm,
but the outside testing may have a more relaxed definition of what a learning disability is than
interesting. Interesting.
the district's regulations is what sets out, does this qualify under this definition? So if a student goes and gets an outside test done and that testing comes back and they provide the diagnosis of, let's say, a learning disability,
Hmm.
and the family takes that to the school, it does not automatically meet the definition as laid out by the state regulations.
Huh.
And this is where, I mean, the medical and the educational system are two separate systems, right? And this
Right.
can be very, very confusing. And it's why one of the things that I make sure to do in my practice is I do not write in my reports, based on this information, a student qualifies for an IEP, for instance. I've seen
Right.
private reports that do that.
Mm,
And as someone who worked in the public school system for several years, it was always super frustrating to read
yeah.
that because it's not how any of this works. And
Right.
it can often set up a very poor dynamic
Mm,
between families and schools when private providers say, oh, well, based on my testing, this child qualifies under state regulations, when they don't have anything to do with that.
right.
Provide that data, and it can be very, very helpful.
Right.
And oftentimes, if the evaluation is done well, sometimes the school may only do a minimal amount of outside testing and can go through the process a lot quicker.
Right.
I had that when I was in practice in schools where sometimes I got these really great comprehensive reports. And so really all I did was collect some data about their performance in school if the outside evaluator had not, for instance, gotten data from the teachers.
Mm,
So they may not have gotten data from the teachers. They may not have had access to the students' prior screening results or things like
right.
that. And so I would actually write a separate report sometimes that just included that small amount of data to
Hmm.
supplement the private evaluation.
Okay.
And so that's something I think is important to point out, that it
Yeah.
is dependent on what those regulations are, not necessarily just if you have an outside diagnosis
Right.
that may or may not be sufficient. It will be for things like autism, ADHD diagnoses,
Okay.
types of things. Those will typically satisfy these criteria. Learning disabilities is where it gets a
Kind of
little
murky.
murky. Yeah, it gets a little bit murky there.
Okay.
Uh, so that's kind of question number one.
Right.
Question number two is, are there any rule outs or any significant factors that may be impacting the child that may be impacting their ability to access the school curriculum, but have nothing to do with the disability?
Oh.
So, for instance, is the child, if we're looking at the learning disability criteria,
Hmm.
one of the questions may be, is this student an English language learner?
Oh. Okay.
Is English their first language?
Right.
How long? And that can sometimes be a rule out as well, where, we wouldn't necessarily expect a child who has only been learning English for the last year and a half
Right.
at the same reading level as a student who is a monolingual English speaker who's been speaking English since they were little, right?
Right.
And so that can be a rule out that has to be looked into. Other ones can be, are there actually other disabilities that could be impacting the child beyond the one being considered? So for instance, if we're looking at the learning disability criteria, do they also have an intellectual disability?
Okay.
For instance, if they have an intellectual disability, that may preclude being identified under the specific learning disability because their academic achievement may be more related to the intellectual disability than to a specific learning disability.
Right.
So there are those types of rule outs that are kind of part two. The third part is often also a point of contention, which
Oh,
is, do they require specially designed instruction? And this
oh,
and this is kind of the very last question on all of these worksheets
right.
is the child's disability severe enough that they are not able to access the regular education curriculum and therefore need that curriculum to be modified in some way in order to meet their needs?
Mm,
And this is where, again, I'm being specific in my language about can they access the regular education,
right.
right? And that tends to be, where the impact comes in, and that can also be again that point of contention because sometimes um, schools or families may have differing views on the extent of the impact and whether or
Right.
not instruction needs to be modified, all that kind of thing. And so that really is based on the severity there,
Okay.
the impact. And the impact does not necessarily need to be just academic.
Right.
And that's, I think, again, something that, families should be aware of. We're also looking at functional impact.
Mm,
So is that student able to access the school curriculum, or are they being hindered by, for instance, their behavior that may
mm,
be the result of their disability,
right.
right? Are they having trouble staying in the classroom? Are they having trouble focusing on the teacher? Are they having peer conflicts that are leading to a lot of outside of class time because
Mm,
you get into a conflict and then get sent to the assistant principal's office and
right.
that takes them out of instruction. So there are a wide variety of impacts that could occur. But that is the third main question for special education identification.
Okay.
The So far, I've been very focused on the special education
Right.
part of eligibility. And the reason for that is because there is the Section 504 accommodations, which
Hmm.
have a different eligibility standard
Okay.
in special education. And it is a lot more relaxed to an extent. It's a lower bar. It's a lower bar to clear.
Okay.
Because there, you're really only looking at two major questions. One is, does a student present with a condition
Hmm.
that impact? And then the second is, does this condition significantly impact any major life activity,
Okay.
which is the language that is used there. And
Yeah.
there are no, unlike special education, with Section 504, there are not like 13 specific categories of
Okay.
disability. It's really anything. It applies to anything, any kind of
Huh.
condition, any kind of disability. It's not limited by category. As long as you identify a major life activity that is impacted. The other really funky thing about Section 504 when it comes to the eligibility is you have to consider what's called mitigating measures.
Okay.
So if we think about this from the standpoint of a physical disability, I think is a good illustration. So if a student, for instance, does not have the use of their legs, right? If
Hmm.
they're paralyzed and they require a wheelchair, the eligibility criteria considers the wheelchair a mitigating measure. So
Okay.
you're not looking for eligibility purposes, you're not considering their mobility in that wheelchair or with any other assistive devices. You're considering, is this major life activity impacted without those, if they did not have access to any of those things?
Oh, okay.
Okay, so like if they did not have a wheelchair, if they did not have any kind of physical supports, for instance, would their mobility be significantly impacted? The
Right.
answer there is obviously yes
Right.
for those types of questions. Where it gets funky when we're talking about mental health diagnoses is
Hmm.
those mitigating measures can include medication assistance, therapy, things like that. So for the purposes of eligibility, if you have a student, for instance, who has ADHD
Hmm.
and they're being treated with medication,
Right.
the eligibility committee has to make a determination for eligibility purposes of what would the student look like without their medication?
Mm,
Would there be a significant impact?
right.
And most times the answer is going to be yes.
Yeah.
If they did not, if they were not significantly impacted, then they would not have the diagnosis and would not be on medication.
Right.
So that's where the bar is lower
Okay.
in terms of Section 504.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was going to ask you, like, what's the difference between special education versus 504? And then would the IEP process be under special ed?
Yes. So
Okay.
actually, special education and IEP are essentially synonymous.
Okay.
Every student who's found eligible for special education services has an IEP.
Okay.
Uh, and if they have an IEP, that means they've been found eligible for special education.
Eligible. Okay. So is that how you start the support process for students who are identified under special ed? Is it the IEP? Is it then you go into the IEP process?
Correct.
Okay.
So yeah, up till now, we've really just done the identification process.
Right.
Looks at is this child eligible for special education services
Right.
or Section 504 accommodations? There is a major difference there that I can get into a
Yeah.
second about what the differences are between the supports available through an IEP and Section 504, because there
Okay.
are major differences. But essentially, whenever a student is found eligible, the next step is then to create a plan.
Right.
And so, sticking to the special education side, if a student is found eligible, then an IEP needs to be proposed by the school within 30 days of that eligibility.
Okay.
So there is a timeline there. And so what happens is if a student is found eligible, the school will essentially assign it to one of their special education teachers.
Mm-hmm.
They'll take all of the data that was collected during the evaluation process and kind of everything they know about this child, and they will develop an IEP that they will then propose at an IEP meeting that has to be held within those 30 days.
Okay.
And that IEP is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of the support services that may be offered.
Right.
And so the biggest thing when we're looking at the IEP is what are the goals?
Mm-hmm.
What are the accommodations?
Right.
And what are the service hours or services that will be provided in order to reach those goals?
Okay.
So every IEP and these documents can look very, very confusing. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've ever read an IEP. It is a very long document.
Yeah.
It has a lot of detail to it and can often be very, very overwhelming.
I'm
But
sure. Yeah.
but at its core, it really is focusing on, based on the needs. It first starts out with identifying, okay, what are the students' needs in particular? What is
Mm-hmm.
individual to this child? Do they have a need in the area of reading? Do they have a need in the area of social emotional, or behavioral support?
Right.
And one thing I haven't talked about yet is that when a student is found eligible for an IEP,
Mm-hmm.
they are eligible for any services or supports that support an identified area of need,
Okay.
regardless of whether that identified area of need is related to the disability for which they were found eligible.
Oh,
So this is the fun one. This is where a
yeah.
lot of times people get things a little bit. It can create more issues than it's worth. Just to be perfectly,
Yeah.
because let's say, for instance, you have a student. So I'm sure you have students at your all's practice who may have ADHD that is, very significant, and as a result of that, they may also have some reading concerns.
Right.
If the student is found eligible for an IEP under other health impairment for the ADHD,
Mm-hmm.
if they have a weakness in reading, even if that weakness does not necessarily reach the level of a learning disability separate category identification,
Right.
they can still be provided with reading support through the IEP,
Oh.
because if it's an identified area of need. So if the data says that their reading scores are low,
Mm-hmm.
they still would have access to, or they still should have access to reading supports, even though what they were identified for was the ADHD.
Right. Okay.
This is what we call being under the umbrella.
Gotcha.
Once a student is found eligible, their IEP is specific to them and their needs, regardless of the area identified.
Very interesting.
Yes. So some schools and some districts will get very particular about this, and they'll want to have students identified under all relevant areas,
Right.
right? Provide those services. And I've seen times where this can get a little contentious, but
Right.
typically speaking, that as long as it's an identified area of need, the child can receive those services
Wow.
and support. So once those needs are identified, then the IEP will lay out a goal.
Mhm.
And so these goals are often written as, by this date, the student will be able to do X, right?
Okay.
It has to be measurable, and so there has to be some way for a special education teacher to be able to measure the progress on this goal,
Right.
right? And then the backside of that is, what are the accommodations and service hours, and specifically the service hours that are going to go into supporting this goal, right?
Okay.
So if, for instance, we have a reading goal, then in the support hours, there needs to be specific reading support services provided in those support hours that will be provided by a special education teacher
Okay.
in that area. And what that looks like will vary from school to school.
Right.
So some schools will, the law regulating this actually says that students are required to be put in what's called the least restrictive environment,
Mm.
LRE. So when you're looking at the IEP, IEP teams need to take into account, okay, what is the appropriate environment for the student given their needs? And they have to go with the least restrictive of all those options that
Okay.
still allow the child to benefit. So in a lot of cases, what this may look like is, instead of being pulled out of their regular education classroom and put in a special education classroom for a period of time, a lot of schools will actually provide what they call push-in services,
Mm.
where a special education teacher will go into the general education classroom and provide support in that classroom,
Okay.
rather than it being a separate kind of pull-out service.
Right.
And so for a lot of students, for instance, with reading needs, they may even have a combination of both. So they may have a period of time where a teacher may push into their regular education class to provide reading support in the class, or they may have also other times where maybe they get pulled out for small group,
Okay.
right? So you may have like 20 minutes a day where the special education teacher takes them and maybe a couple other students. They may go into a separate classroom, for instance, that's often the special education teacher's classroom.
Mhm.
And there they will do small group reading intervention.
Okay.
And so that would be considered a pull-out service. That's still that's considered, anytime a student is pulled out of the general education classroom, that's considered a more restrictive placement.
Oh.
Therefore, it needs to be kind of justified based on the student's needs.
Okay.
Um, and so all those things kind of have to work together,
Right.
right? Kind
Yeah.
of have to, we have the identified needs, we have the goal, and then we have the support services that support those goals.
Right.
And so this is also where you may have things like speech goals, OT goals, PT goals, all of that kind of stuff can be put in there. And in the IEP process, within special education, so schools are actually provided through federal funding.
Mhm.
That's how they have the ability to have special education teachers, for
Okay.
instance. So so school districts will identify, how many students may have an IEP or qualify for special education. That gets put through a whole formula. Schools will get funding, in order to support those students.
Right.
The reason I bring this up is this is a major difference between special education and Section 504.
Oh.
Because Section 504 only provides accommodations. It does not provide direct support services.
Okay.
It just may provide accommodations like extended time or small group testing, or the ability to, let's say, like put in earplugs during testing or something. It can accommodate any of those things, but it does not provide for direct provision of support in most cases. There are some edge cases here and there. That's a whole
Right.
separate thing. For the most part, it only provides for those school-based accommodations. And the school is provided with no funding to support those accommodations.
Wow.
So
Okay.
that's kind of a main difference there. Is the school is simply, and a lot of things that are in the 504 plan, teachers can do without a 504 plan.
Right.
It's just that with the 504 plan, it's legally required
Right.
that we provide those accommodations.
Wow.
That's kind of a main difference there in terms of the support services.
Yeah, I didn't realize that about special education versus 504, which I'm glad you mentioned. The 504 is more just the accommodation. So it kind of sounds like it's stuff that students kind of implement themselves, supported by their gen ed teacher. Is that kind of more how that works?
Kind of. So it depends on what level they're at in terms
Okay.
of, are they like elementary versus middle school versus high school. So
Right.
oftentimes high schoolers, for instance, may have to um, advocate
Right.
for accommodations.
Hmm.
They shouldn't have to though, because they should be legally provided by the school team.
Right.
If it's determined that this student requires this, um, and I haven't gotten into this, it kind of goes back a little bit, but if a student's found eligible for Section 504,
Hmm.
they're actually not automatically found eligible for a plan.
Oh,
It's different from special education and 504. With special
yeah.
education, anytime a student is found eligible, they have to have an IEP.
Okay.
Students found eligible for Section 504 accommodations, there's a separate question of, do they require a plan
Oh,
along with that eligibility? And this can be different because remember, if we go back to our previous discussion, for Section 504, we sometimes have to create a separate version of the child that exists only in some magical fantasy land.
right. Exactly.
The child, for instance, not on their medication.
Right.
For the creation of the plan, you actually have to take into account, how does the child present in school day to day?
Oh.
So I've had students, for instance, who qualify under Section 504,
Hmm.
but in day-to-day school, they don't require any accommodations. So
Oh,
they may not have a plan. They are still afforded the legal protections of Section 504,
okay.
but which comes into play when we get into things like discipline, and that's a whole other side of IEPs
Okay.
that can be very important, especially for students with behavioral concerns, so like autism spectrum,
Right.
ADHD. That's another good reason to find us for parents to have their students found eligible, is they are actually afforded specific legal protections in the case of if their child engages any behavior that may face repercussions
Hmm.
in school, or any kind of punishments like expulsion. If they face any legal repercussions such as expulsion, they are actually provided with a certain amount of protection
Oh,
under Section 504 and under special education IDEA, that schools have to determine whether or not the student's actions were a result of their disability. And
okay.
if actions were a result of their disability, then they can't be expelled.
Wow.
It's-
That's big.
It is a big other side. So
Yeah.
within special education, if you have a student, for instance, who has, again, let's say autism, right?
Mhm.
And let's say you have a loud noise that happens. Like, let's say there's an unknown fire emergency,
Right.
something happens. This causes a student to have a significant, panic attack, or
Right.
have they may have very high sensory needs. And then in this moment of crisis, they pick up a chair and they throw it across the room.
Right.
A general education student who picks up a chair and throws it across the room is likely to be suspended or expelled for a significant amount of time.
Right.
A student who has an IEP, though, if the school decides that they do, if a lot of times schools may not even enforce anything, they may not even go
Okay.
down, because they may say, okay, we understand what happened to the student. We don't blame them for their
Right.
actions. They're like, and they just don't enforce consequence. However, if schools did want to enforce a consequence there and say, okay, we're going to expel this student,
Hmm.
then a meeting has to be held called a manifestation determination meeting,
Okay.
where it has to be determined whether or not that the student's behavior was a manifestation of their disability.
Oh,
And if
okay.
it's a manifestation of their disability, then they may not be expelled.
Right.
Okay, so especially if the team was kind of following all procedures
Right.
as well. So that's a whole separate side of
Right.
Section 504 and IEP protections. That's how we often will refer to them, as the kind of protections that come along with this.
Right.
But for Section 504, students can get that accommodation plan that should be provided to them,
Hmm.
as accommodations. But yeah, they don't have any direct support. Whereas with IEPs, every student with an IEP has a case manager, often who's a special education teacher,
Hmm.
who is in charge of implementing the IEP and may provide many of those service hours
Okay.
to that student in particular, and is also in charge of monitoring their progress.
Right.
So once a student has been found eligible, they have their IEP, And parents, again, have a lot of say in this process, right? So if
Right.
the school says, for instance, we think your student is eligible and the family disagrees,
Mm.
the family can sign that they disagree and the student is not found eligible. A student cannot be placed in special education unless it's agreed to by the family,
Wow.
by the parents or guardians,
Yeah.
right? And in Virginia, it's actually taken a step further for parents. So in Virginia, if a student has been found eligible and then for whatever reason the school wants to dismiss that student from special education services, and this can happen at many different points of time. It could be a reevaluation. So every 3 years, students have to be reevaluated to
Okay.
determine if they continue to be eligible. If
Right.
the school reevaluates and says, we think that the student no longer qualifies, then the family actually has the ability to say, no, we don't agree with you.
Wow.
And the student stays in special education services.
Okay.
So that they cannot be dismissed by the school district alone without the parents' consent.
Wow. That's
So
important.
yeah, it's an important kind of legal thing. Now, again, that's Virginia specific though.
Okay.
So it's not the same in every state. Typically, these meetings are the decisions have to be made by a consensus of the committee,
Okay.
is what it's called, which again looks a little bit different depending on the state or things like that. But parents
Right.
always have the right to also challenge those decisions and go
Right.
through. They can go through an appeals process if they don't agree with any of this. But so if students found eligible, an IEP is proposed. If parents find the IEP acceptable and they say, okay, this looks good,
Mhm.
they're getting support, and then they can sign that IEP, and then that IEP will immediately go into effect as of that day.
Okay. Wow.
As of the day of that meeting, the IEP immediately goes into effect. Every year, that IEP has to be revisited.
Okay.
So every year, parents will have what they call an IEP meeting,
Mhm.
where the school will sit down with the family, go through the IEP, and discuss: do we need to update any of the goals? Do we need to change any of the service hours? Make any kind of tweaks or adjustments to the IEP. So that happens once a year, but parent by law, mandatorily, it has to happen at least once a year.
Okay.
Parents are also welcome to call an IEP meeting at any point if they
Oh.
believe changes need to be made.
Okay.
So sometimes what schools will do, and parents can do, is they can even agree to say, okay, we're going to put this IEP in place for X number of days,
Right.
and then we're going to sit down and revisit it again
Okay.
and see if we need to make any additional adjustments,
Right.
because the student is new in that process,
Right.
right? And they're still kind of maybe calibrating the level of support necessary.
Yeah.
So parents are always welcome to hold an IEP meeting if they think any changes, like if they want to add or take off any accommodations, if they want additions or subtractions in service hours, all that kind of stuff, they can call that meeting at any time.
Okay.
And then every 3 years, they have to do what I mentioned before, which is the
Right.
reevaluation process, in which the school has to sit down and determine, does this child continue to qualify for special education services?
Okay.
And it's treated as an eligibility meeting,
Oh, wow.
not an IEP meeting. So
Okay.
it often gets confusing for some families because they come in, they're used to having the IEP meetings, and they're called in for a reevaluation, and it's a very different meeting. It's
Right.
going back to the eligibility and saying, does this child continue to qualify?
Right.
Some schools, depending on the student, that may be a very quick meeting, and they may say, yes, we have all the data to say that the student continues to present with the same disability.
Right.
And just go through it. Other times, schools may engage in a completely new testing process.
Wow.
So
Okay.
okay, and again, this depends on the district. Some districts will, retest a student every, like, let's say 6 years or so, 5 or 6 years. Some districts may not test again unless they really suspect that there's a change in disability status.
Right.
And so that's, again, district to district. But that meeting has to occur at least once every 3 years.
Okay. And is it just the meeting that is mandatory? Or if they get to the meeting and they say, like, we don't think your child presents, or whatever they come up with, but the parent wants them to be reevaluated, like have all the testing done again, can they request that there, or do they have to just wait?
Yeah. So they can request updated evaluations. And this is where I think it's important to note, in terms of evaluations is that evaluations in general, and this is true for private as well as public evaluations, they're a snapshot of a student in time
Right.
that aids in determining whether or not they present with a disability.
Mm-hmm.
What they are not good at is tracking change over time.
Right.
So I want to throw that out there because I've had parents request updated testing because they say, oh, well, it's just been a while and I kind of want to see where they are compared to where they were. And that's not really how the tests are designed. That's not how the data we collect is designed. It's designed to compare the student at this moment to other students their age.
Right.
It does not track their progress over time. That should be, there are data sources that do that, and the IEP team should be collecting data over time
Right.
to inform that.
Okay.
And actually families should be kept in the loop of that data. So one thing I forgot to mention is in addition to the yearly IEP meeting, parents are sent should be being sent a quarterly update and progress report.
Oh, okay.
At least in most districts.
Right.
So that's a requirement that like every quarter the family is updated, the family's updated in terms of their child's progress in terms of their IEP goals.
Okay. So that's, you think, a better like display of how they're progressing as opposed to just getting testing done for another time.
Right. Because our testing doesn't, our testing doesn't look at like if you compare a student score at time 1 and time 2, it doesn't really tell you whether or not growth has occurred for that. In fact, sometimes if you have a number go down a little bit, parents are like, oh my God, they regressed. And no, they actually may have more skills than they did the last time they were tested. You're still just comparing them though against other students their age.
Right.
And so in terms of the growth line may not be quite as steep as an average growth line.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that they've lost skills. It doesn't mean that they've gone backwards.
Right.
And so that's often, something to kind of keep in mind as well, is that you should have a good sense as a parent. And this is something oftentimes parents may need to keep on top of their schools for, is they should have a good sense of how their child is progressing and what data is supporting that assertion, right? So if the school is telling you that your child is doing well, ask for the data as well. And this is where, I think getting into some of the public versus private, and a little bit of some of the work that I do is, if families are not comfortable with what their school is telling them, I do recommend, seeking out maybe an outside advocate, consultant, someone who knows the data and the information and how schools operate, in order to, get a better sense of, okay, what's going on here? Does this data mean what I think it means?
Right.
Those can be great things to reach out for some assistance as well.
Yeah, that's important. But yeah, I think it's like you said, the testing, since it is comparing students to other students their age, that is a really good thing to remember, that it won't show the progression. And like you said, that getting an advocate in the room for IEP meetings, because like you said, there can often be a lot of people in meetings like that. So I'm sure it's intimidating.
Yes, that is, sometimes, like if I'm in the room with the family as an advocate, one of my goals is really to figure out how do we collaborate with the school, but it's also, I'm sitting there able to listen to the language that's being used, and sometimes it's the words, like there's terminology. Some schools I've been in or worked with are very good about breaking things down. Other schools tend to talk in a lot of their own vocabulary. They kind of have their own words, their own language, and that can often be very confusing for families as well, because they're not used to that, those terms and kind of what they mean, and it's looking out for those specific things. If so and so says this is what this may mean, and that can be a little bit challenging as well. So the other aspect of support that I do want to touch on is there is a difference between school-based supports and private supports. Right? And so school-based supports are going to be very focused on how do we help this child access their education. Private supports may have broader goals than that. Some families may have broader goals than that. And so, for instance, I think a great example is actually with speech, is
Hmm.
that I've worked with a number of families who their child may or may not qualify for speech services in school,
Hmm.
but they're still a little bit behind.
Right.
And in those cases, it can be beneficial to go to an outside speech language pathologist. I've also seen this with OT very frequently as well, where
Yeah.
they may not qualify for OT services in school, but there's still some OT concerns. They may have handwriting concerns, fine motor concerns, things like that.
Hmm.
That's where seeking out private services can often be very helpful. The eligibility criteria are, less strict,
Right.
at that support. And that support may, the goal for that support may be a higher bar than you would see within a school setting. Because, for
Oh,
instance, if in speech, for instance, if a student is, really far behind, they receive school services, and then they make a lot of progress, they may be dismissed from speech, and the parents may be like, well, but they're still not like right where they need to be.
right.
And it's like, yeah, they may not be right where they need to be compared to a typical child their age, but they're also not low enough to have it be significantly impacting their educational progress, right? Or
Right.
their ability to access their educational curriculum.
Right.
And so in those cases, it may be beneficial to seek out private services to help the child get that, to strengthen those skills even further,
Yeah.
to help out in that sense.
That is interesting because I guess you don't think about it because as a parent, like, or a guardian, like your best in like your kid and their overall being is like in your best interest, right? Whereas like
Yep.
the school, it's like we're focused on the education because we're school. So they're always going to look at the education piece. And of course they want the best for your kid too, but they have so many other kids that they're like, well, we got to focus on just the education of all the kids.
Right. And it's really looking about how do we spread out these disability services as well amongst
Right.
what often very needy populations. So I think some families, if they've never, had to real, I don't think always families understand how much support services are available
Hmm.
for especially very high needs kids in our schools.
Right.
So since the last district that I worked in, we have an entire center devoted to students with very complex medical needs.
Oh,
So these
wow.
students are often wheelchair bound. They need help with feeding. They need help with toileting.
Wow.
They, have very limited communication skills.
Hmm.
And the school district is paying for them to have, all day access to care
Wow.
with specialists who, they will work with a speech language pathologist to work on those communication skills. They will work with an OT, they'll work with a PT.
Right.
They'll bring in specialists to work with them in order to, help them as much as possible. And that's a very, very high level of need. I mean, you're talking sometimes two kids per teacher in that
Wow.
2-to-1 setting. Very restrictive setting, obviously,
Yeah.
but for students, they need it. And for those families, it's amazing to have that level of support available to them so that they can do things like go to work and not worry
Right.
about the health and safety of their child
Right.
during the day. And so school districts are often trying to balance these competing needs as well.
Yeah.
So they're looking at, okay, is this child able to access the general education curriculum?
Hmm.
And that's kind of where the legal support services may be.
Right.
Uh, that's where that line may be. I think good schools and a number of good schools will provide additional supportive services
Mhm.
outside of these legal processes.
Oh,
So, for instance, if a student's having some social emotional concerns, they may be in a small group with a school counselor or with a
yeah.
school psychologist to help address those needs. They may have other concerns that are going on where the school is providing support, but it may be informal
Okay.
to that student as well. And so a lot of schools are trying to do their best with providing, what their students may need, but they have a wide variety of supports available, but they also
Yeah.
have to kind of follow the legal guidelines as far as what students require those for a disability.
Right. This is kind of random, but I know some schools in the Northern Virginia area have like a volunteer program where like adults will come in and kind of like mentor a student. Is that part of the kind of like support system for special ed? Or is it just a school? Is it just a school thing to have mentors for students?
So that's a school-wide thing that would be kind of outside of the special education process.
Okay.
And in fact, people coming in from outside. So this is one of the other interesting things is that when a student is found eligible for special education, that is technically confidential information.
Right.
So it's not something that teachers or administrators would share to outsiders who are not like directly involved by the school
Right.
in the care of that child per se. And that's something important to note as well, that the records, the evaluations, all of that is considered confidential information. It's not shared outside the school, outside the school team, right? And this is also why, if school wants to talk to, or if there's a private provider, schools will often provide, for instance, a release of information. So
Mm.
parents have to actually sign a document that says, yes, I'm allowing you to speak with my child's outside provider.
Right.
The school cannot release information about that child to, just anyone, or especially this
Right.
confidential information. Any information the schools have does not directly go to anywhere outside the K through 12 system
Oh,
unless
wow.
requested by the parents. So this is
Right.
something that also I've seen some trepidation about
Hmm.
is, oh, does this go like in my child's permanent record
Record.
of some kind? And within the school system, yes, it's in their file,
Right.
but those school system records do not go beyond the school system
Right.
once the child graduates from. So if, for instance, if a child goes to college, the school doesn't tell the college whether or not the child has an IEP.
Okay.
Parents can disclose that to the college if they want services,
Right.
but they don't. Schools do not tell colleges that a child had an IEP or what their services are.
Right.
And once a student is graduated, though, if the student's been graduated for more than, I think most places it's 5 years, some places it may be 10, but after a period of time, all of those records are simply destroyed.
Wow.
So there's no
There's no keeping them. There's nothing.
keeping them. I mean, parents are welcome to request any of the
Right.
documents, and they can have them for their files.
Hmm.
School systems will over time destroy those
Yeah.
documents as well.
It's good to know. Yeah. I think that was my last question for you.
Okay.
But do you have anything else you want to add?
I think in general, my biggest thing would be to remind parents that you are the best advocate for your child, and you are a key component in this entire process.
Yeah.
And so, schools should be keeping you informed as these processes unfold, right?
Right.
And if you have these concerns, you are welcome to go to your schools and school districts at any time and talk to them about them. And then if you, for whatever reason, are not satisfied with their response, that's a good time to reach out to, someone outside the system, whether that's an advocate, consultant, who knows the system. And I think it's important to also make sure that you're comfortable with that person
Right. Yeah.
as well. Because I've worked with some great advocates who really know the school systems that they are working in, and are trying to build good collaborative relationships to really get everyone on the same page to best support this child.
Right.
Others may be a little different. They may come in a little bit more aggressive. They may, have a different approach. And so I think for families, really, thinking about, sometimes getting that outside support, but also making sure that outside support aligns with what your goals are
Right.
for your child, and making sure you're having that conversation, I think is extremely important as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. This has been incredible information. And like I said, I think very helpful to parents, kind of like demystifying this process that can be really scary and kind of intimidating. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on. And as I said, families are welcome to go to my website at jdspsychoed.com and reach out to me if they have any additional questions or concerns, or would like to talk about things going on with their particular student. And I'm also looking at putting out some webinars that actually address this topic as well for families, and also for providers as well, to give them more information.
Yeah.
In order to kind of best serve our students in a collaborative and collegial manner as well.
That's awesome. Well, again, I'll put the your website and email in the show notes so people can look out for those webinars, especially.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you so much to the audience for listening. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a little rating and review. It helps other folks find the podcast, and we'll chat with you next time.